impose on Iran a set of realities that Iran could not come back from, and that the regime would collapse. So what we're dealing with right now is you're dealing with two countries, the United States, or actually three countries, the United States, Israel, and Iran, each with their own politics, each with their own power base, and they're trying now to move down the escalation ladder towards diplomacy. But it's very, very tricky, because it's when you transition from a military kinetic kind of engagement to political engagement, you're basically negotiating multiple ways. You're negotiating, I mean, the Iran saying they're closing the strait and the U.S. saying they're sustaining the blockade. That's a form of negotiation. That is a form of, it's grandstanding in a way, but it's a form of negotiation designed to try to improve each of the country's positions when they get to Islamabad for the next round of negotiations. So it's a very treacherous time, Christina, because as they move down the escalation ladder, Iran in particular, being a middle power, negotiating with a global power, the United States, if the United States imposes the blockade or maintains the blockade, and Iran opens up the strait completely, then the concern is that when they get to the negotiating table, that will be construed by the White House or by the negotiators as weakness on the part of Iran. So I think what you're seeing is both parties trying to de-escalate, but also to use the threat of escalation.
The oil industry. And so with that leverage, is President Trump, with his use of sanctions, these blockades, or does Iran have more power at this point with their ability to not necessarily, as you said, completely close the Strait of Hormuz, but that balancing power? Who has the upper hand at this point?
Yeah, well, I think the end game here, certainly for Iran, and to some degree for the United States, but particularly Iran, is to when the ceasefire, assuming it will be renewed, or there will be some kind of a framework agreement, not a final agreement, but a framework agreement. Each of the countries wants to make sure they can claim some kind of a win. And for Iran, the win is basically having recreated deterrence. And so for the Iran to basically, the main deterrent factor is not their military capabilities. It's basically their ability to, at some future date, if they are attacked again, to close the Strait of Hormuz. So in terms of who has the most bargaining position at this point, I think it is, listen, the United States has the ultimate ability to escalate further and push Iran in a different particular direction. I think what Iran has the ability to do is basically to demonstrate that they can still deny the global community a safe passage. They can't physically necessarily stop ships from flowing, but deny them a safe passage. And in that way, that's the end of the day. After the United States blockade ends, Iran still maintains that capacity. And I think that's important to understand, that when the U.S. destroyers leave and this conflict winds down, Iran still, because of its geography and because of the way it's built its capabilities, it will always have the ability, should it need it, to close the Strait of Hormuz. So in a way, that gives Iran an advantage. But right now, I think the thing to focus on is that what we're seeing in the Strait and with the Strait of Hormuz and the blockade in the Gulf of Oman by the United States is basically bargaining at this point as they're moving towards negotiations.
Absolutely. And we're going to continue to refer back to this map so we can see what that marine traffic is looking like at this time amid all of this. And of course, we know that I want to take it back as well to last weekend. We were able to speak, Ross. We were talking about how important it was that it was historic, that those talks between the U.S. and Iran were the biggest since the 1979 Islamic Revolution. Ultimately, though, a deal was still not made at that time. What are you thinking about future conversations? How are they going to be able to close the gap if a historic and, again, a majorly networks were covering everywhere? We knew that Vice President J.D. Vance was on the ground there in Islamabad, still not able to come and make an agreement. What are we looking at as those talks move forward?
Well, Christina, these matters are, particularly when we're dealing with maritime matters and then the nuclear issue. These are extremely complex negotiations. And I know we talked last week about the fact that Vice President Vance was negotiating for 21 hours or up for meeting with for 21 hours. In terms of actually bringing this conflict to a final end, it's not going to happen in the next few days. What we can best hope for is some kind of either set of principles or framework agreement, the details of which then get worked out at some future date, 30 days, 60 days. And even that kind of a deadline would be a rush deadline. If you go back to the nuclear deal we call the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, which the Obama administration negotiated in 2015 and which the Trump administration walked out of in 2018, that took months and months, and actually over a couple of year period to get to some kind of final agreement, what we call the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. And this negotiation is even more complex because it's not going to be just about the nuclear issue. It's going to be about the nuclear issue and then also the Strait, and then also some financial remunerations, some unfreezing of assets, removal of sanctions, all sorts of intertwined issues. So what I think we would expect over the few days, assuming that we move to a new round in Islamabad, is taking whatever agreement or lack of agreement took place last week, start with the areas of disagreement and try to winnow down that list and get to a framework agreement where both sides can say, we are going to start to de-escalate now based upon this framework agreement. And then you want to bring technical expertise and technical experts on both sides to try to actually work out the details. But that's not going to happen in the next couple of days. The best we can hope for is some kind of a handshake, either with President Trump or without President Trump, handshake to give it some kind of a political impetus to move forward. And then the details would have to be worked out in the coming weeks and months.
All right. And we also know that other agencies and other countries around the world are also putting their input in. We're just playing out some of these brief remarks that we had from just yesterday with there you see the UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer also was President Macron of France. So they had this summit to discuss reopening the Strait of Hormuz. How have they been sort of involving themselves or not involving themselves in this conflict that's ongoing, even though the oil that is not coming out of the strait is affecting those European countries?
Yeah, the oil and the liquid natural gas as well. I think what we've seen, Christina, is that during the actual kinetic fighting, the Europeans were pretty clear that they were not consulted in the early days, the lead up to this war, and they were not party to the war, and they were not going to put themselves in the position of being in an active war zone. But I think what you're seeing now, Christina, as we're moving towards the possibility of a cessation of hostilities and some kind of a arrangement between the United States and Iran, and we haven't talked about Israel, but the United States and Iran, I think what they're planning for is the day after. In other words, how do they help not enforce any of the agreements necessarily, but how can they help both sides, help the Iranians, help the Gulf Arab states? How can they return this very, very critical waterway to some degree of normalcy? And I think they will be a constructive player in that regard because they have relationships across the Gulf. They have relationships with Iran. So I think they can play a constructive role once the agreements are made between Washington and Tehran.
All right, Ross, one of my last questions here for you is going to be about Pakistan, because we talked a lot about them, their role, being that they were the host country for those historic talks just a week ago. How are they continuing to be a part of those ongoing negotiations? And maybe folks weren't with us last week. Can you sort of speak to what unique position that Pakistan is in that allows them to be able to help these two countries who are at odds have a conversation?
Well, Pakistan, first of all, has a functional relation, not a warm relationship with Iran. It's been tense, actually. And it has actually a closer relationship with Saudi Arabia. So it has a relationship with the Gulf Arab states and also with Iran. So that helps. And it also has a close relationship with the United States. So I think that's an important piece here. And I think President Trump has mentioned that he's enamored of the Pakistanis and so forth. So I think that helps both with the optics and the substance. But the other thing I think is important to mention is who's not necessarily part of these negotiations or not playing that role now, and that is the Gulf Arab states. Oman has played that role in the lead up to this war. They were playing the same role in the lead up to this war, negotiating between acting as an intermediary between the United States and Iran on trying to negotiate on the nuclear issue just days before this war started. And now that those states have been attacked by Iran during this conflict, they're protagonists in this conflict, so they cannot play a mediating role. So I think Pakistan is well situated in terms of it having a relationship with the various protagonists in this conflict and also close relationship with the United States to provide a safe venue, a trusted venue, and and enhance their own diplomatic position going forward as well.
All right. And so we're seeing some images from those conversations that happened just last week with Vice President J.D. Vance. Ross, I appreciate you for being with us here on Live Now from Fox. Any final thoughts before I let you go? Of course, we didn't get to touch on the Israel and Hezbollah conversation there in Lebanon. But anything else we should be looking at as this back and forth over the Strait of Hormuz continues?
Well, I think the Israeli piece is really important, Christina, because if you remember when the cessation of hostilities took place between the U.S. and Iran, actually, Israel sort of doubled down on its kinetic activity with respect to Hezbollah. So I think it's important to understand now, after President Trump said basically imposing a ceasefire between Israel and Hezbollah, I think what that signifies is that at least now the Iranians understand that in the eyes of the United States, the Hezbollah Israel piece is connected to the battle with Iran. So that's a constructive piece, and I think is a positive signal for the Iranians. And what we hope for is that Israel, which I believe is leaving this battle, not having achieved the objective it wanted, which was basically elimination of this regime change, or collapse of the state of Iran. That is being. It looks at this point. That looks like that's being denied to Israel. So I think the United States is going to gain something from this. Iran is going to gain, hopefully, I say hopefully, from their perspective, they're going to regain deterrence, and the Israelis are going to be. It'll be interesting to see how that plays out, given the tense political situation within Israel in the coming days and months.
Absolutely. We're taking a live look there over the skyline in Beirut. We were also just taking a live look there in Israel, overlooking the skyline in Tel Aviv. A lot is still happening there in the region. Multiple different conflicts, multiple different ceasefire agreements on the table, some coming to an end, like the one with the U.S. and Iran as of Wednesday. We'll see if that gets extended. But we do want to thank, as always, Ross Harrison for being with us here on Live Now from Fox, Senior Fellow there with the Middle East Institute. Thanks so much for your time, Ross.
Thank you, Christina.
All right, we are going to continue on with our top stories that we're following today. Let's take this opportunity, though, to first step away for a quick 2-minute commercial break. Much more after this.